10 years earlier, Amara had left Kofi's house carrying nothing except a small suitcase and the last pieces of her dignity. The villagers remembered that day well. Some said she was foolish for leaving. Others whispered that Kofi had finally grown tired of supporting a woman who came from a poor family. Nobody knew the full truth. They only saw the ending. Kofi had been ambitious, charming, and respected. He owned a growing transport business and liked being seen as a successful man. Amara, on the other hand, came from a farming family. She had no wealthy relatives, no influential connections, and no inheritance waiting for her. During the early years of their marriage, she worked beside him tirelessly, helping organize records, speaking with customers, and finding ways to save money when the business struggled. But as the company grew, so did Kofi's pride. He began introducing her less often at public events. He stopped asking for her opinions. When investors arrived, he acted as though he had built everything alone. The more successful he became, the more embarrassed he seemed by the woman who had stood beside him from the beginning. Eventually, another woman entered his life. She came from a wealthy family and moved comfortably among businessmen and politicians. Kofi became fascinated by the image she represented. Within months, his marriage collapsed. Amara left quietly. No public fight. No dramatic confrontation. She simply walked away. What nobody noticed was that she also carried something far more valuable than money. She carried knowledge. She understood how the business worked from the inside. She understood markets, customers, and opportunities. Most importantly, she understood herself. While villagers spent years discussing her failure, Amara disappeared into the city. People assumed her story was over. They were wrong. Sometimes the most dangerous person to underestimate is the one who leaves without arguing. 10 years later, Kofi would learn that lesson in a way he could never forget. 10 years later, Kofi stood in front of a mirror adjusting his expensive suit. His transport company was celebrating its 20th anniversary. Politicians, investors, and business leaders would attend. The event would be held in the largest hotel in the city. Everything had been carefully planned to showcase his success. As he reviewed the guest list, a mischievous smile appeared on his face. One name caught his attention. Amara. He had not seen her in years. Occasionally he heard rumors. Someone claimed she worked in a small office. Another said she ran a modest shop. Nobody seemed certain. Kofi assumed life had been difficult for her. The thought pleased him more than it should have. Invite her, he told his assistant. The woman looked surprised. Your ex-wife? Yes, Kofi replied casually. It would be nice for her to see how far we've come. But his words concealed a different intention. He wanted her to see what she had lost. He wanted her to sit among wealthy guests and compare her life to his. He wanted confirmation that leaving him had been her greatest mistake. When the invitation arrived, Amara stared at it for several minutes. She read every line carefully. Then she smiled. Not because she was excited. Not because she was nervous. Because she immediately understood why it had been sent. Her assistant entered the office. Will you attend? He asked. Amara looked out through the massive glass windows overlooking the city skyline. Yes, she answered softly. I think it's time. The assistant nodded without understanding. Across the city, Kofi imagined a poor woman struggling to decide whether she could afford a dress for the event. He had no idea that while he prepared to impress his guest, preparations were already underway for a surprise that would change the entire evening. Sometimes arrogance blinds people to the very danger standing directly in front of them. The morning after receiving the invitation, Amara arrived at work earlier than usual. The security guards greeted her respectfully as her car entered the underground parking area. Employees stepped aside as she walked through the marble lobby. Some nodded. Others smiled. Everyone knew her reputation. Not because she demanded respect, but because she had earned it. 10 years earlier she had arrived in the city with almost nothing. She rented a tiny room above a tailor's shop and worked wherever she could. During the day she managed records for a small logistics company. At night she studied business management and supply chain operations. Most people who met her during those years never saw her cry, even when life became difficult. They only saw a woman who kept moving forward no matter how many obstacles appeared in her path. One opportunity led to another. A supervisor noticed her intelligence and promoted her. A director recognized her leadership skills and gave her greater responsibility. Within a few years she was overseeing regional operations. Then she helped save a struggling transportation company from collapse by redesigning its entire distribution system. Investors noticed. Executives noticed. Soon, the woman once dismissed as a poor farmer's daughter was sitting in boardrooms where multi-million-dollar decisions were being made. But success had never changed her character. She still remembered every difficult night. Every sacrifice. Every insult. Most importantly, she remembered the day Kofi looked at her and decided she wasn't good enough to stand beside him. Sitting in her office now, she opened the invitation once more. Her fingers traced the company logo printed across the top. A small smile appeared on her face. Not because she wanted revenge. Not because she hated Kofi. Those emotions had faded long ago. What interested her was something else entirely. Fate had a strange sense of timing. Because Kofi believed he was inviting an unsuccessful ex-wife to witness his success. What he didn't know was that 3 months earlier, a large international investment group had quietly acquired controlling ownership in his company. The acquisition had been handled through multiple corporate layers. Most employees didn't even know it had happened yet. And the executive selected to oversee the transition and become the new chairperson of the board was arriving at the anniversary event personally. That executive was Amara. Kofi thought he was preparing a lesson in humiliation. In reality, he was preparing the stage for the biggest surprise of his life. The evening of the anniversary finally arrived. The Grand Meridian Hotel glittered beneath hundreds of lights, its entrance crowded with luxury vehicles and important guests. Politicians, business owners, investors, and journalists moved through the elegant ballroom, exchanging greetings and compliments. At the center of it all stood Kofi, smiling confidently as cameras flashed around him. This was the moment he had spent months preparing for. Every decoration, every speech, every detail was designed to showcase how successful he had become. Guests congratulated him as he moved through the crowd. 20 years is impressive, one businessman remarked. Kofi smiled proudly. It's been quite a journey. Yet beneath his confidence, he kept glancing toward the entrance. He was waiting for someone. Waiting for Amara. Part of him wondered whether she would even come. Another part hoped she would arrive wearing the same modest expression he remembered from years ago. He imagined introducing her to powerful guests and watching her realize how far ahead he had moved without her. Then, shortly after 8 o'clock, the ballroom doors opened. Several people turned their heads. Conversation slowed. Even the musicians seemed quieter for a moment. A woman stepped inside wearing an elegant dark blue gown. Her posture was calm. Her confidence effortless. She wasn't trying to attract attention, yet attention followed her immediately. Kofi stared. For a second he wasn't sure it was really her. Amara looked nothing like the woman who had left his house 10 years ago carrying a worn suitcase. She moved through the room with the quiet authority of someone who belonged in every space she entered. Behind her walked several executives from major companies. They greeted her warmly. Some even seemed eager to speak with her. Kofi felt a strange sensation in his chest. Confusion. He quickly forced a smile and approached her. Amara, he said. I'm surprised you came. She smiled politely. Thank you for the invitation. The simplicity of her response unsettled him. He expected discomfort. He expected awkwardness. Instead, she seemed completely relaxed. As if she had nothing to prove. Around them, guests continued arriving. More than once, Kofi noticed influential investors stopping to greet Amara before greeting him. Each time, the feeling in his chest grew stronger. Something wasn't making sense. But before he could ask questions, the event coordinator approached him. "Mr. Kofi," she said quietly, "the chairperson's arrival has been confirmed. The board presentation will begin in 30 minutes. Kofi nodded confidently. He assumed the new chairperson would appear by video call from overseas. He had no idea the person she was referring to was already standing in the room, calmly sipping a glass of water while the biggest surprise of the evening moved steadily closer. 30 minutes later, the ballroom lights dimmed. Conversations faded into silence as guests turned their attention toward the stage. A large screen illuminated the room while elegant music played softly in the background. Kofi stood near the podium, feeling completely in control. This was his moment. The celebration of everything he had built. The event coordinator stepped forward with a microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen," she announced, "thank you for joining us for this important milestone. Tonight marks not only 20 years of achievement but also the beginning of a new chapter for this company." Polite applause echoed through the ballroom. Kofi smiled confidently. The coordinator continued. "As many of you know, our organization recently entered a strategic partnership with an international investment group that has become the majority shareholder of the company." Kofi nodded. Everyone already knew about the acquisition. What they didn't know was who would lead the transition. The coordinator paused dramatically. "It is now my honor to introduce the new chairperson of the board and executive director responsible for guiding the future of this company." The room became quiet. Kofi glanced toward the giant screen, expecting a pre-recorded video message. Instead, the coordinator turned toward the audience and smiled. "Please welcome Ms. Amara Mensah." For a moment, nobody moved. Kofi blinked. Certain he had heard incorrectly. Then applause erupted across the ballroom. Guests rose to their feet. Investors smiled. Executives nodded respectfully. And Amara calmly stood from her seat. Kofi felt the blood drain from his face. His heart pounded so loudly he could barely hear the applause. No. This couldn't be happening. Yet it was. Amara walked toward the stage with complete confidence. Every step seemed to shatter another piece of the reality Kofi believed he understood. She accepted the microphone and waited for the applause to settle. The room belonged to her now. "Thank you for being here tonight," she began. Her voice was calm, professional, powerful. "This company has tremendous potential, and I look forward to helping lead its next chapter of growth." Kofi stood frozen. Around him, people he considered important were listening to her with admiration. Respect. Authority. Everything he once believed belonged only to him. Then Amara's eyes briefly met his. Not with anger. Not with revenge. Simply with quiet confidence. The confidence of a woman who had rebuilt her life while everyone underestimated her. At that moment, Kofi finally understood the truth. He had invited his ex-wife expecting to embarrass her. Instead, he had unknowingly invited the woman who now controlled the future of his company. And as the applause filled the ballroom once again, he realized the night he had planned for her humiliation had become the night of his greatest lesson. The applause continued long after Amara finished her speech, but Kofi barely heard any of it. The ballroom seemed distant, as though he were standing underwater while everyone else celebrated on the surface. Guests who moments earlier had been congratulating him were now gathering around Amara. Investors shook her hand. Politicians introduced themselves. Journalists requested interviews. The attention naturally flowed toward the person who now held real authority. Kofi stood beside the stage trying to maintain his smile, but every muscle in his face felt strained. He remembered the invitation he had sent. He remembered the satisfaction he felt imagining her arrival. He remembered telling friends that she would finally see how successful he had become. The memory now felt like a cruel joke. One businessman approached him and laughed politely. "You never mentioned your former wife became one of the most respected executives in the region." Kofi forced a smile. People change. But the answer sounded weak even to him. Across the room, Amara continued speaking with guests. She looked comfortable, confident, completely unaffected by his presence. That hurt more than anger would have. If she had arrived seeking revenge, he could understand it. But she wasn't interested in humiliating him. She wasn't even thinking about him. The realization struck harder than any insult. For 10 years he had imagined himself as the main character of a story. Yet standing in that ballroom, he began to suspect he had become little more than a forgotten chapter. As the evening progressed, more details emerged. Executives spoke openly about Amara's achievements. They described the companies she had transformed, the investments she had overseen, and the thousands of employees who worked under her leadership. Every new fact felt like another stone added to the weight pressing on Kofi's chest. Then one investor casually mentioned something that froze him completely. "The restructuring begins next month," the man said. "Chairwoman Amara will personally evaluate all executive positions." Kofi's smile vanished for half a second. Executive positions. His position. Suddenly the evening was no longer embarrassing. It was dangerous. For the first time since Amara stepped onto the stage, fear quietly entered the room and sat beside him. The anniversary celebration ended after midnight, but the story spread through the city before sunrise. By morning, social media pages were filled with photos from the event. Business blogs published articles about the company's new leadership. Employees shared images of Amara standing on stage. In office corridors, restaurants, and meeting rooms, people repeated the same surprising story. The ex-wife everyone assumed had failed had returned as the most powerful person in the company. Kofi arrived at headquarters the next day expecting normal operations. Instead, he walked into an atmosphere that felt completely different. Conversations stopped when he entered rooms. Employees exchanged quick glances. Secretaries whispered near elevators. Nobody was openly disrespectful, but something had shifted. Authority is a fragile thing. Once people believe power has moved elsewhere, they begin adjusting their loyalties almost immediately. Kofi spent the morning reviewing reports, trying to focus on work. But his concentration kept breaking. Every email seemed connected to Amara. Every meeting referenced upcoming restructuring plans. By lunchtime, another rumor had begun circulating. Some employees claimed several departments would be audited. Others believed management positions would be reviewed. Nobody knew the truth, yet uncertainty spread rapidly. Kofi tried calling several board members he considered allies. Their responses were polite but distant. "We'll know more after the executive review. The new chairperson will make those decisions. Let's wait and see." Wait and see. The phrase repeated itself throughout the day. By evening, Kofi sat alone in his office staring through the window at the city skyline. For years he had enjoyed complete control. Decisions began and ended with him. Now someone else held the final authority. Someone who knew him better than almost anyone. The irony was impossible to ignore. Years earlier he had dismissed Amara because he believed she lacked value. Now the future of his career rested in her hands. And the worst part was not knowing what she planned to do next. 3 days later, official notices were delivered to senior management. Each executive would participate in a comprehensive performance review led personally by Chairwoman Amara. The announcement immediately became the most discussed topic in the company. Some managers felt confident. Others became nervous. Kofi felt both emotions at once. He knew parts of the business had struggled during recent years. Revenue growth had slowed. Operational costs had increased. Several major projects had failed to meet expectations. Until now, nobody questioned his leadership because nobody possessed enough authority to do so. That protection no longer existed. The review meeting was scheduled for the following week. Every day leading up to it felt longer than the last. Kofi spent hours examining reports and financial records. The deeper he looked, the more problems he discovered. Some had been ignored. Others had been hidden beneath temporary solutions. For the first time, he saw the company through the eyes of an outsider. The picture wasn't flattering. Late one evening, he remained alone in his office reviewing numbers when he noticed movement through the glass conference room across the hall. Amara was there. She sat with several analysts studying documents. Their discussion appeared intense. Charts covered the table. Financial projections glowed across large screens. Kofi watched from a distance. Years ago he had convinced himself she wasn't capable of understanding business at his level. Looking at her now, the memory felt absurd. She wasn't simply participating in the review. She was leading it. Hours later the conference room emptied. As Amara walked past his office, their eyes met briefly through the glass. She nodded politely and continued walking. Nothing more. No bitterness. No accusation. Yet somehow that calm professionalism unsettled him more than hostility ever could. Because it suggested she no longer viewed him as a former husband. She viewed him as an executive whose performance would soon be evaluated. That weekend Kofi visited his mother in the village. He told himself he needed rest, but the truth was simpler. He needed distance from the pressure building around him. His mother noticed the tension immediately. "Something is troubling you," she said. Kofi hesitated before explaining everything. The acquisition. The anniversary event. Amara's return. His mother's expression changed slowly as she listened. When he finished, she remained silent for a long moment. Then she asked a question he wasn't expecting. "Did you ever thank her?" Kofi frowned. "For what?" His mother looked directly at him. "For helping build your company." Kofi opened his mouth to answer, but no words came out. She continued. "You talk as though everything happened because of you alone. That isn't true." Memories resurfaced. Long nights balancing accounts. Early mornings meeting customers. Difficult years when Amara walked beside him without complaint. The memories were uncomfortable because they challenged the version of history he preferred. "She chose to leave," Kofi said quietly. His mother shook her head. "No. She chose to stop carrying a burden you refused to share." The words lingered long after the conversation ended. Driving back to the city, Kofi replayed them repeatedly. For years he had blamed Amara for the collapse of their marriage. It was easier than examining his own actions. Easier than admitting pride had influenced his decisions. Now those old explanations felt increasingly fragile. The closer he came to the executive review, the harder it became to avoid the truth. And deep inside, another fear was growing. What if Amara remembered everything? Monday morning arrived. Employees moved through headquarters with unusual tension. Everyone knew executive reviews would begin that day. Shortly after 9 o'clock, Kofi's assistant entered his office carrying a sealed envelope. This was delivered from the chairwoman's office. Kofi stared at it for several seconds before opening it. Inside was a formal notice. His review meeting would take place on Wednesday at exactly 10 a.m. in the executive boardroom. Attached was a list of documents he was required to bring. Financial reports. Operational summaries. Strategic plans. Performance records covering the last 5 years. The meeting was expected to last 3 hours. Kofi placed the papers on his desk and leaned back in his chair. For a long moment he simply stared at the ceiling. 3 hours. 3 hours alone in a room with the woman he once dismissed. 3 hours during which she would examine every decision he had made. Every success. Every failure. Every weakness. Outside his office, employees continued their normal routines. Phones rang. Elevators opened and closed. Meetings began and ended. Yet for Kofi, everything suddenly felt different. He wasn't preparing for another business presentation. He was preparing for a reckoning. Not only as an executive, but as a man confronting the consequences of choices made years ago. Across the building, Amara reviewed her schedule calmly. Wednesday, 10 a.m. The name on the calendar read, Kofi Mensah. She closed the file and moved to the next document. Professional. Focused. Unemotional. But neither of them knew that the meeting scheduled for Wednesday would reveal a secret neither had expected. A secret buried since the final days of their marriage. And once it surfaced, everything would change again. Wednesday arrived with unusual silence. By 9:45 a.m., Kofi was already sitting outside the executive boardroom. The folder in his hands contained every report requested by the chairwoman's office, yet he barely looked at it. His mind was occupied by something else entirely. 10 years. 10 years since he and Amara had sat across from each other for any meaningful conversation. Back then they had spoken as husband and wife. Today they would meet as executive and chairperson. The difference felt enormous. At exactly 10 a.m., the assistant opened the door. "Mr. Mensah, you may come in now." Kofi entered. The boardroom was quiet except for the soft hum of the air conditioning. Large windows overlooked the city skyline. Several analysts sat at one side of the table reviewing documents. At the head sat Amara. Professional. Composed. Focused. She looked up briefly and gestured toward an empty chair. "Please have a seat." There was no hostility in her voice. No personal emotion. Only business. For the next 90 minutes, she reviewed reports with precise attention. Revenue trends. Operational performance. Cost management. Strategic planning. Every answer Kofi gave was followed by another question. Every weakness was identified. Every success was acknowledged without exaggeration. Slowly Kofi realized something uncomfortable. She wasn't trying to embarrass him. She was simply better prepared than anyone else in the room. The meeting continued until one analyst presented a file from the company's earliest years. The period when Amara had still worked beside Kofi. As the documents appeared on the screen, everyone became quiet. There were records showing business plans, supplier agreements, and financial restructuring strategies. Several carried Amara's signature. One investor frowned. These initiatives were responsible for the company's first major expansion. Another analyst nodded. According to these records, Ms. Mensah designed most of the original logistics framework. Kofi stared at the screen. He remembered those nights. He remembered her suggestions. He remembered taking credit during presentations while convincing himself it wasn't important. Across the table Amara remained silent. She didn't correct anyone. She didn't seek recognition. But for the first time, the people in that room saw something Kofi had hidden from himself for years. The company he claimed to have built alone had never truly been built alone. And the deeper they looked into the records, the more impossible it became to deny. The meeting paused briefly for lunch. Most executives left the room, but Amara remained reviewing documents. One analyst approached her carrying an old archive folder. "We found something else from the early years," he said. Amara accepted it without much interest. Then she noticed the date. It was from the final year of her marriage to Kofi. Her expression changed slightly. She opened the file. Inside were several letters and financial proposals she had completely forgotten about. One document immediately caught her attention. It was a proposal for a major regional transportation contract. She remembered writing it. At the time, winning that contract could have transformed the company. Yet she also remembered Kofi dismissing the idea. He claimed it was unrealistic. Too ambitious. A waste of time. Curious, she continued reading. Then her eyes widened. Attached to the proposal was a letter from the client company. The contract had actually been approved. The opportunity had been real. The client had been waiting for a response. But according to the records, no response was ever sent. Amara slowly sat back in her chair. This wasn't just a missed opportunity. The contract was worth millions. More importantly, it could have changed the direction of both their lives. She continued reading. Several pages later she found something even more surprising. Notes written in Kofi's handwriting. Comments. Corrections. Then one sentence underlined heavily. Reject proposal. Not necessary. Amara stared at the words. For years she believed the project had failed because the client lost interest. Now she was discovering the truth. It had never failed. It had been deliberately abandoned. Why? The question lingered in her mind. By the time the afternoon session resumed, she knew the meeting was no longer just about business performance. Somewhere inside those archives was a piece of history neither of them fully understood. And before the day ended, she intended to find it. Late in the afternoon, the review shifted towards strategic decisions made during the company's early growth period. Amara placed the old contract proposal on the table. Kofi immediately recognized it. A feeling of unease settled in his stomach. Do you remember this? Amara asked calmly. Kofi looked down at the document. Vaguely. It was one of our biggest opportunities. I suppose so. Amara slid the client approval letter across the table. Then why was it rejected? Silence. The analyst exchanged glances. Kofi opened the file and read the letter. Even though he had seen it years ago, the memory returned immediately. He remembered exactly why he rejected it. But admitting the reason would expose something he preferred to keep hidden. I don't recall, he answered. Amara held his gaze for several seconds. I think you do. The room became quiet. Finally Kofi looked away. The truth embarrassed him even now. At the time, the proposal had been praised by investors and suppliers. Everyone spoke about Amara's intelligence. Everyone complimented her work. Instead of feeling proud, he felt threatened. The attention she received triggered insecurities he never acknowledged. Eventually those insecurities became resentment. Rejecting the proposal wasn't about business. It was about ego. He couldn't bear the possibility that her success might overshadow his own. Because people kept saying it was your idea, he admitted quietly. No one spoke. Even the analyst stopped taking notes. Amara's expression remained calm, but inside she felt something shift. For years she wondered why certain opportunities vanished. Why some plans never moved forward. Why support suddenly disappeared. Now she finally had an answer. Not incompetence. Not bad luck. Pride. A single decision driven by pride had changed the course of multiple lives. Kofi stared at the table. Speaking the truth aloud somehow made it worse. Because now everyone could see how small the reason really was. And for the first time, he wondered what else his pride had cost. The review officially ended at 5:30 p.m., but neither Amara nor Kofi stood up immediately. Most executives had already left. Only the city skyline remained beyond the glass windows, glowing beneath the evening sun. For several moments neither spoke. Then Amara closed the folder. There was something else from that year, she said quietly. Kofi looked up. What? She hesitated. The memory had remained buried for a decade. During the final months of their marriage, she had received an offer from a major international company. The position would have required relocating to another country. It was the opportunity she had always dreamed about. Yet she declined it without ever telling him. At the time, she believed saving her marriage mattered more. She believed supporting her husband mattered more. I was offered a senior management position overseas, she said. Kofi blinked. What? I turned it down. The surprise on his face was genuine. Why? Amara looked out toward the city. Because I thought we were building a future together. The words landed heavily between them. For years Kofi assumed she left because she wanted more. More success. More ambition. More freedom. He never considered the possibility that she had already sacrificed opportunities for him. Suddenly the story he told himself about their marriage began falling apart. One piece at a time. And as the silence stretched between them, both realized they were finally discussing truths that should have been spoken 10 years earlier. That night Kofi returned home emotionally exhausted. The executive review had ended, but its impact lingered in his mind. Every conversation. Every document. Every forgotten memory. Shortly before midnight his phone vibrated. The message came from an unknown number. At first he assumed it was business-related. Then he opened it. Attached was a photograph. The image showed Amara standing beside a young girl approximately 8 years old. Both were smiling. Kofi frowned. He had never seen the child before. Then another message arrived. You deserve to know the truth. Ask Amara about the year she left. Nothing else. No explanation. No name. Kofi stared at the screen. A strange feeling settled over him. The timing made no sense. Who sent the message? Why now? More importantly, who was the little girl? He enlarged the photo. Something about her face seemed familiar. The eyes. The smile. The shape of her jaw. His heartbeat slowed. Then suddenly accelerated. No. That wasn't possible. Yet the thought refused to disappear. Across the city, Amara sat alone in her apartment reviewing tomorrow's schedule when her phone rang. She looked at the caller ID and immediately became tense. It was a number she hadn't seen in years. She answered. The voice on the other end spoke only one sentence. Someone has sent him the photograph. Amara closed her eyes. For 10 years she had successfully protected a secret. A secret connected to the final days of her marriage. A secret she never intended to reveal. But as she stared out at the city lights beyond her window, she realized something inevitable was approaching. And when the truth finally emerged, neither her life nor Kofi's would ever be the same again. Kofi barely slept. The photograph remained open on his phone long after midnight. Every time he convinced himself he was imagining things, he looked again. The resemblance felt impossible to ignore. The young girl's eyes looked familiar. Her smile looked familiar. Even the way she tilted her head reminded him of someone he saw every morning in the mirror. By sunrise he had already reviewed the image dozens of times. When he arrived at headquarters, work felt meaningless. Reports sat untouched on his desk. Emails went unanswered. The photograph occupied every corner of his mind. Around noon he finally made a decision. He walked directly to the executive floor and requested a private meeting with Amara. Her assistant informed him she was busy. Kofi insisted. 30 minutes later he entered her office. The moment the door closed, he placed his phone on her desk. The photograph filled the screen. For the first time since he had known her, Amara looked genuinely shaken. Her calm expression disappeared instantly. Neither spoke for several seconds. Who sent this to you? She finally asked. Kofi ignored the question. Who is she? Amara remained silent. Amara. His voice cracked slightly. Who is that child? The city skyline stretched behind her office windows while silence filled the room. For 10 years she had prepared herself for difficult conversations. She had never prepared for this one. Because the truth she protected wasn't only hers anymore. It belonged to someone else. Someone innocent. Someone whose life could change completely depending on what happened next. Kofi watched her carefully. The longer she remained silent, the stronger his suspicion became. Finally Amara stood and walked toward the window. Her reflection appeared faintly in the glass. "Her name is Adana," she said softly. Kofi felt his heartbeat accelerate. And another long silence. Then Amara closed her eyes. "And she's your daughter." The words hit him harder than anything he had experienced in years. The office suddenly felt too small. Too quiet. Too unreal. He stared at Amara, waiting for her to say she was joking. Waiting for her to explain. But she didn't. Because for the first time in 10 years, the truth had finally entered the room. Kofi sat motionless. The words repeated inside his mind again and again. "Your daughter. Your daughter. Your daughter." Nothing else seemed real. Finally he looked up. "Why?" It was the only question he could manage. "Why didn't you tell me?" Amara returned to her chair slowly. Her eyes remained fixed on the desk. "Because when I found out I was pregnant, our marriage was already over." Kofi said nothing. She continued. "You had stopped seeing me. Not physically. Emotionally. Every conversation became criticism. Every achievement became a threat. Every sacrifice became invisible." Her voice remained steady despite the memories. "I planned to tell you many times." She paused. "Then I discovered you were already planning a future that didn't include me." Kofi remembered those final months. The arguments. The distance. The growing resentment. "I thought you left because you wanted more than I could give." Amara shook her head. "No. I left because I had nothing left to give." The room fell silent again. Then she opened a drawer and removed an old envelope. The paper had yellowed with age. Inside were several unsent letters. One after another. Every letter began the same way. "Kofi, there's something important I need to tell you." She handed them to him. "I wrote these after I left." Kofi flipped through the pages. Some were unfinished. Some contained tear stains. None had ever been mailed. "Why didn't you send them?" Amara's answer came quietly. "Because every time I tried, I remembered the man you had become." The words weren't cruel. That somehow made them hurt more. For 10 years Kofi believed he was the victim of abandonment. Now he was discovering another version of the story. One in which his own choices had pushed away not only his wife, but a daughter he never knew existed. That evening Amara drove home in silence. For years she had protected Adana from complicated truths. To the little girl, life was simple. She knew her mother loved her. She knew they lived comfortably. She knew she attended one of the best schools in the city. What she didn't know was why questions about her father always ended quickly. Amara parked outside a beautiful home overlooking a small garden. Through the window she could already see Adana sitting at the dining table working on homework. The sight immediately softened her expression. The girl looked up and smiled. "Mama," she shouted excitedly. Amara smiled back. For a few moments she allowed herself to enjoy the ordinary comfort of home. But later that night, after Adana had fallen asleep, she sat alone on the balcony thinking about the future. The secret had survived 10 years. Now it was collapsing. The question was no longer whether Kofi would learn the truth. He already had. The question was what happened next. Across the city Kofi stared at the photograph once again. Except now he wasn't looking for resemblance. He was looking at moments he had missed. First steps. First words. School graduations. Birthdays. Bedtime stories. Every year lost forever. The realization felt unbearable. He had spent years mourning a marriage without realizing he should have been mourning something far greater. For the first time since receiving the photograph, tears appeared in his eyes. Not because he lost Amara. Because he lost 10 years with a child who never even knew his name. 3 days passed before Kofi contacted Amara again. During those days he barely focused on work. Every spare moment was consumed by thoughts of Adana. Finally he requested another private meeting. This time his expression looked different. Less proud. Less defensive. Older somehow. He sat across from Amara and spoke carefully. I don't want to fight. Amara nodded but remained silent. I don't want lawyers. I don't want arguments. Another pause. I only want one thing. Amara already knew the answer. You want to meet her? Kofi nodded. His eyes revealed a vulnerability she had not seen in years. Please. The word surprised both of them. Kofi was not a man who often asked for anything. Yet now he sounded almost desperate. Amara looked away. Part of her wanted to protect Adana from uncertainty. Another part knew she couldn't hide the truth forever. Eventually every child asks questions. Eventually every secret reaches its expiration date. She doesn't know about you, Amara said quietly. Kofi lowered his head. I know. And if I allow this meeting, you move at her pace. Not yours. Of course. No promises you can't keep. I understand. Amara studied him carefully. The arrogant man who once dismissed her seemed absent. In his place sat someone carrying genuine regret. Whether that regret could be trusted remained unclear. But for the first time in years she sensed something real inside him. Something broken. Something human. Finally she exhaled slowly. I'll think about it. It wasn't a yes. But it wasn't a no. For Kofi, it felt like the first ray of sunlight after a very long storm. While Kofi struggled with his newfound truth, another person was watching events unfold closely. A former executive named Bernard sat inside a private office reading reports about the company. Years earlier he had expected to become chairperson after the acquisition. Instead the board selected Amara. Since then resentment had quietly grown inside him. When Bernard learned about Kofi and Amara's history, he saw opportunity. Information. Secrets. Weakness. The very tools ambitious people use to gain power. It was Bernard who had sent the photograph anonymously. It was Bernard who wanted old wounds reopened. And now that the secret was finally exposed, he intended to push even harder. Sitting alone in his office, he smiled while reviewing confidential files. People make terrible decisions when emotions are involved, he said quietly. His assistant looked confused. Bernard simply closed the folder. And that's exactly what I need. Across the city, neither Amara nor Kofi knew they were being manipulated. Both believed the revelation happened by chance. Both believed the greatest challenge ahead involved confronting their past. They were wrong. Because while they struggled to understand each other, someone else was already preparing to use their history against them. And very soon, the future of the company itself would be at risk. A week after Kofi learned about Adana, the atmosphere inside headquarters became tense. Strange rumors began circulating among investors. Anonymous emails questioned Amara's leadership. Financial reports appeared online without authorization. Journalists suddenly started asking unusual questions about the company's stability. At first the incident seemed unrelated. But Amara had spent too many years in business to believe in coincidences. She quietly launched an internal investigation. Within days, security teams discovered something alarming. Someone inside the company had been leaking confidential information. Someone was actively trying to create distrust between investors and leadership. During an emergency board meeting, evidence began to emerge. Email records, access logs, financial documents copied without permission. Every trail pointed toward one person, Bernard. The former executive who believed the chairperson position belonged to him. As investigators continued digging, they uncovered something even worse. Bernard had not only leaked company information. He had also obtained private records connected to Amara and Kofi's past. The anonymous photograph. The messages. The timing of the revelation. None of it was accidental. Bernard had engineered everything. He wanted emotional chaos. He wanted conflict. He believed personal drama would weaken leadership and create an opportunity for him to seize control. Sitting in the boardroom, Kofi listened in disbelief. For months he blamed fate for the sudden appearance of old secrets. Now he understood someone had been manipulating events from the shadows. Across the table, Amara remained calm, but her eyes revealed disappointment. Not because Bernard attacked her. Because he had used Adana as a weapon. And that was something she would never forgive. While the investigation continued, Amara finally made her decision. One Saturday afternoon, she drove Adana to a quiet botanical garden on the edge of the city. The location was peaceful, filled with flowers, trees, and walking paths. Kofi arrived early. He stood near a fountain with nervous hands and a racing heart. No business meeting had ever frightened him this much. When Amara and Adana appeared in the distance, time seemed to slow. The girl walked beside her mother, laughing about something completely unrelated to the moment that was about to change her life. Amara knelt beside her daughter. "There's someone important I want you to meet." Adana looked curious. Kofi stepped forward carefully. For a second, neither spoke. Then the little girl smiled politely. "Hello." Kofi felt emotion rise inside his chest so suddenly he struggled to breathe. He had imagined this moment countless times during the previous week. Nothing prepared him for reality. "Hello, Adana," he replied softly. The conversation began awkwardly. Then gradually became easier. They talked about school, books, favorite foods, animals. The simple things children discuss naturally. By the end of the afternoon, Adana was laughing comfortably. Watching from a nearby bench, Amara felt emotions she couldn't fully describe. Relief, fear, hope, sadness. 10 years of separation couldn't be repaired in a single afternoon. But something important had happened. A door that remained closed for a decade had finally opened. As the sun began to set, Adana asked a question. "Will I see you again?" Kofi's eyes met Amara's briefly before he answered. "If your mother agrees, I would like that very much." The girl smiled. And for the first time since learning the truth, Kofi felt something stronger than regret. He felt gratitude. The investigation concluded 2 weeks later. The evidence against Bernard was overwhelming. Internal communications, financial records, witness statements, and security reports painted a complete picture. He had orchestrated a campaign designed to destabilize the company. Worse, he had intentionally exploited private family matters for professional gain. During the final board hearing, Bernard attempted to defend himself. "I was protecting shareholder interest," he argued. No one believed him. The board voted unanimously. His employment was terminated immediately. Legal proceedings followed. Investors who once respected him now avoided him entirely. The reputation he spent years building collapsed within days. As Bernard left headquarters carrying a small box of personal belongings, employees watched silently. There was no celebration. No cheering. Only the quiet reality of consequences finally arriving. Through the glass entrance, he saw Amara standing near the lobby. For a brief moment their eyes met. Bernard expected anger. Instead he found something worse. Indifference. She simply turned away and continued walking. At that moment he realized he had lost more than a position. He had become irrelevant. The company moved forward without him. The future continued without him. And the power he chased so desperately disappeared from his reach forever. Several weeks later, Kofi invited Amara to dinner. Not as a romantic gesture. Not as an attempt to rebuild the past. Simply as two people who had unfinished conversations. They met at a quiet restaurant overlooking the city lights. For a while they discussed Adana. School plans. Weekend visits. Family routines. Then silence settled between them. Finally Kofi spoke. "I've apologized before." Amara nodded. "Yes." He stared at his glass. "But those apologies were mostly for myself. I wanted forgiveness because I wanted relief." The honesty surprised her. Kofi continued. "This time I don't expect forgiveness. I only want you to know I finally understand what I did." Amara remained quiet. "I made you carry everything alone. Then I convinced myself it was your responsibility." He paused. "And I lost 10 years with my daughter because of the man I chose to become." The city lights reflected across the restaurant windows. For several moments neither spoke. Then Amara smiled faintly. "Understanding doesn't change the past." "I know. But it changes the future." Kofi nodded slowly. That was enough. Not reconciliation. Not romance. Something simpler. Respect. The thing their marriage lost long before it ended. And perhaps the most valuable thing either of them could recover. 1 year later, the company reported record growth. Investors celebrated. Employees prospered. Under Amara's leadership, operations expanded across multiple countries. Kofi remained with the organization, but not because of past status. He earned his position through performance and accountability. More importantly, he became a consistent presence in Adana's life. Not perfect. Not trying to erase lost years. Simply present. One afternoon the company held another major anniversary event. The ballroom looked remarkably similar to the one where everything changed. During her speech, Amara thanked employees, investors, and partners. She spoke about resilience, growth, and second chances. In the audience sat Kofi and Adana. The little girl listened proudly as her mother received a standing ovation. Looking around the room, Kofi remembered the invitation he sent years earlier. The invitation designed to humiliate a poor ex-wife. He almost laughed at the memory. Because the woman he intended to mock had returned not only as his boss, but as the person who taught him the most important lesson of his life. Success wasn't measured by power, or money, or status. It was measured by character. And character is revealed most clearly in how we treat people when we believe we no longer need them. As applause filled the ballroom, Adana grabbed his hand and pointed toward the stage. "That's my mom." Kofi smiled. "Yes," he said quietly. "And she's extraordinary." For the first time in many years, there was no regret in his voice. Only truth.